Good afternoon and welcome to Optimizing Your Software Testing Process to Increase Throughput and User Satisfaction, a Health Systems CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by Tricentis. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Health Systems CIO, and I'll be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. Send in your questions or comments at any time in the Q&A box, and we'll take them later in the program. Nice way to view the screen is you click in the top center, get it in side-by-side mode, then you can adjust the divider to get the slides and the video boxes the size you want, and it should say speaker view in the top right-hand corner. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, first we're going to go about 35-40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring Arthur Ream, Senior Director of IT Applications and CISO with Cambridge Health Alliance, Josh Wherry, Director of Data Management and Analytics at Baystate Health and the CTO of TechSpring, which is the incubator of Baystate Health, and Will Berry, Director of Consulting with Tricentis. So let's jump right in for our conversation. Art, can you give us an overview of your organization and your role?
Yep, Cambridge Health Alliance is a 3-hospital system in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, Everett, and Somerville. With 18 primary care clinics, we are the Public Health Commission for the city of Cambridge. So it's a quasi-public organization. The hospitals are acute care hospitals, but they are not like NICU advanced care hospitals. We have a large behavioral health population, and we serve the greater Boston area for primary care and behavioral health. My role there is the Chief Information Security Officer, both of the health system, the health department for the city of Cambridge, and our self-insured program.
Very good, Art. Thank you. Josh?
Baystate Health is an IDN located in Springfield in Western Massachusetts, consisting of 5 hospitals. Our primary hospital, Baystate Medical Center, is roughly about 800 beds, 12,000 employees, 3,100 physicians, and 80 medical practices. Our system includes level 1 trauma center, urban health center, home care services, hospice, regional reference lab, and then the University of Massachusetts Medical School as well. My role as the Director of Data Management, Analytics, and CTO for TechSpring basically covers and oversee the Center for Excellence for Analytics and Data Management at Baystate, our enterprise integration team and service bus, mobile and web development, and then I oversee also the development and system engineering of Cerner electronic medical record.
Very good. Thanks, Josh. Will?
Yeah, hey, I'm Will Berry. I'm with Tricentis. Tricentis is the leader in continuous testing. We're responsible for delivering quality at the speed of change. My role for the past 4 years has been a director of consulting, where I've worked with some of our largest customers about structuring QA organization and testing practices around automation. Currently now I'm transitioning into a new role where I'm working with our customer base on how to get the most value out of their organization from a quality standpoint.
Quality. Okay, very good. All right, next question. We're going to start with Josh on this. What is the process for deciding which user-requested software customizations are made? How do these customizations align with other planned updates driven by the vendor or IT?
So over the years, we've evolved a lot in how we actually handle requests and customizations. We've worked very hard now in putting in some pretty standardized intake and demand processes for those requests coming in. So now we have governance and oversight committees that those requests go to. Over the years, as our EMR has evolved, our other systems have grown, we've realized the impacts of any kind of customization or upgrade. So now most requests, even the smaller ones, go through some type of vetting and governance structure. We also have an architecture group we've established that's basically architects and technical leads across our division to actually review each of these requests coming in. And some of the tactics we take there first is, do we have something that can already do this? Is there already something in place? Is this something that could be achieved through workflow as opposed to customization? And then from there, we really dig into that technical impacts of our system, our function, and our workflow with those customizations. As part of that, we then work with our vendors to see how that aligns with their roadmaps as well. It's a heavier process. It takes longer to get something through vetting, but it also protects us on the other end as we get into implementation.
Very good. Lots to go into there. Art, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, they're similar on the line of Josh. Particularly, we have groups of individuals that are disciplined in their particular areas in the software, and evaluate the requests coming in from the users, and then it goes to a larger forum if it's impacting multiple divisions. Like Josh had mentioned, and it evaluates whether it's the right thing to do when we make these changes. The customizations, obviously. We do have a programming unit in IT that does the programming and the testing across the board if we decide to undertake a customization. We try not to do it too much with the software vendors and talk to them just like Josh does and say, look, is this on your roadmap in 6 months, 3 months? We also have a process where we gauge the request based on a set number of criteria. So in other words, we have a set number of criteria that the user has to do, like financial impact, clinical impact, and it's a scoring system that we rank. And if there's various questions to each category. There's 6 categories, and depending on where it scores in that determines whether we're going to undertake it ahead of the vendor being able to do it. So in other words, the vendor says, it's a year out, we'll custom program it, and hopefully we'll be able to back it in with them, and they'll be able to code over it, and we'll actually be able to absorb it as standard code from that point forward. As you know, and Josh knows, and everybody here, when you start doing a lot of customizations, it's quick and easy to break something. And when you take regular updates to the core software, it tends to be an issue with IT to test and make sure functionality stays in place.
That's really interesting. How you describe that process of making changes, dealing with the vendor, finding out what they're up to, and then how that term used, the backing it in. Very interesting. Will, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think very much in line with what you've heard from Art and Josh. Most of what we see kind of from the industry is moving in the direction of configuration over customization. We want to find tools that allow us to be able to set things up the way that we want without having to build our own custom solutions. One of the things that Josh made point to is that's really important is that testing begins kind of all the way at the front of the organization when these requirements come in, where you vet and decide whether or not these are things that work across the application portfolio and what you're trying to accomplish, and whether or not you have channels in order to be able to do that. So you want to make sure that you're always kind of starting up there in the beginning with even testing the validity of the requirement. One of the things that I kind of really enjoy about the healthcare organization is they have kind of a very solid root in quality assurance when it comes from like a patient matter. And if you think about the way, the old statement, treat the patient, not the problem, like we need to look at testing in our organization in somewhat of that same kind of magnitude, that if you focus too much on like an individual object, you lose the view of the impact from an overall company perspective. And I think you heard both Josh and Art kind of communicate that in their process that they're looking at.
All right, next question, Art. We're going to start with you on this one. What is your process for customizing software such as the EHR, ERP, and CRM? How are changes made, tested, and then introduced into production to reduce the likelihood of errors? Have you had to adjust or adopt new strategies as your software has evolved?
Yeah, pretty much like I mentioned earlier. Overall, there ends up being a need on the end user base. So they're gonna do the ask across the board and say, okay, I need this functionality in the EHR, the ERP, the CRM. Oftentimes, because we have a large vendor for those products, we have found two things. A, it's on the roadmap down the road for the vendor, and we evaluate that timing. B, we've already got it and just don't know it because they're so large, and we may not know the functionality is in there and the ability to do it at this point in time. So we consult with obviously your representatives at the vendor level. And if we decide to undertake it, it goes through that process that I mentioned before. It goes the scoring process. We decide if we're going to code it in there. If the vendor says it's a year out, we really need it, we'll do the coding for it. We'll run it through our testing scenarios. So in other words, if it was for the EHR and a particular clinical area, we'll run it through a full range of scripts that run through, a real fake patient, and go through the iterative testing. So we do the unit testing, then we'll flow through the full integrated testing for the downstream system, see if it does anything wacky, should it be sending something through the interface engine. And then we'll QC it after that and do all of the, the documentation. And then we'll roll it live from that point forward. Then we actually catalog those customizations so that we know each time we go through an upgrade or an update, we know we have to check those customizations down the road.
Very good. Josh?
Similar processes. As a change or customization comes in, and to sidetrack a little bit, but a little bit what Will said there is you have configuration, you have customization. And with Cerner and our EMR, those kind of intertwine a bit because Cerner allows a lot of configuration, so much so you really start customizing because you're straying from the path of Cerner's model hospital build. So even in the configuration pathway, we still have to be pretty careful about that as far as what we can break in those processes. But as something comes in, we put it through the process, right? A pretty standard running through a 10% build in a build environment, right? To vet out the change of the customization. From there, we move to a dev environment to 100% build. Throughout these processes, we do different levels of testing. We do unit testing, usually a couple rounds of unit testing. Once we do the 100% build, then we'll look at doing some level of system and integrated testing to see the impacts of downstream and upstream flows. From there, we usually then go to production, right? There's a pretty rigorous process of how to get it to production, the implementation plan, how to back out for production if you run into any issues, and then command center and other type of support once we get those configurations and changes into production. As far as adjusting strategies, right, as things are evolving, the system is getting more complex, we're trying to be more robust in our testing processes. We're still really hands at the keyboard, test scripts and testing processes. We do need to automate, and we're looking at starting to go down some of those pathways. The other thing we're trying to do is have more robust non-production systems. So in some cases, like our integration engine, we have a stage environment that actually receives production feeds. So as a last step, we move all of our code into the stage environment. It runs against production feeds for a week, sometimes a month, to actually let it process against true production without impacting production. Then once that looks good, then we make the change to actually move into production. That's heavy. There's a cost to that. So we can't afford to do that across all of our systems right now, whether it's resource capacity or money. But that, for us, that's an ideal pathway. It allows us to put that last check in place to really truly validate against production.
Well, what are your thoughts on what you're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, the approach is great. And I think that one of the things that we have to keep in mind is exactly what Josh was saying. No matter where you're buying your software from, whether it's a vendor or you're building this yourself, you have to think about how it's designed and the use cases around that. And Josh kind of alluded to it with Cerner as you start to take your business approach and work with your business, these applications take on an entirely different life form than maybe the vendor intended to. So you have to be very direct in the approach to the way that you test your software because it's relevant to your processes and your people. And I think that this is where, when you look at your testing and how you're going to get testing more in the direction of the business, you've got to leverage your SMEs a whole lot, your subject matter experts. And you need to empower them with tools that allow them to be able to do things like automation so that they can create assets that align again to that whole direction that you're trying to take that product and be able to develop that product. And then because they're automated assets, you're able to get much more visibility or execution time against those. So you're able to test the changes on a much higher frequency. And this ultimately drives down the issue of error. The other thing that I think that is really important when you're talking about these critical business systems is the risk that is associated to them. And they all have, in each of them, they all have their own different levels of risk in terms of the area that you're looking at. In the healthcare, if you talk about customer billing or customer data, I mean, the risk is exponential, and you have to make sure that there's high degree of testing around those systems. You might be have a little bit more flexibility in some other areas. So one is what you're really trying to do is understand that even as you're making just configuration changes, you're evolving that application in a direction that you need to be able to understand and measure. You need to be able to associate risk to how you're going about testing and make sure that you're always covering a large portion of your risk as what you might potentially expose. And then you want to be able to leverage the skills of your business to be able to validate that and being able to put them in a position to be successful. So those are kind of the three things. And I think that, you know, that pushes you towards being able to be confident in a release and avoid what I kind of call the avocado release, which is we think we did everything, we think we have it all right, but we're not sure if we're quite right. Or if anybody's opened an avocado, you know, you sit there, you look at it, but you never know until you open it up. And I think that that's where we are sometimes with our releases. We're wondering, did I do all the right things before I go to production? And it's kind of this avocado for us. And until we put it in production, we're not sure. So we want to get better tools, better measures in the back end to know exactly what's taking place there.
Yeah, I mean,
and I think, go ahead, Art.
Yeah, one of the things that, you know, both Josh and Will mentioned is that, you know, the heavy, we're currently considering, we're trying to find a reasonable solution to automate those scripts and those testings with somebody that can actually put in the different steps. You know, I mean, we do it currently on a paper format and track it, and we know what the steps are, but ultimately that takes 6 or 7 analysts or testers or SMEs to go down through those scripts and go down through that testing. And ultimately, you really can only cycle it so many times because you're running out of human capital to get it done. I mean, you're constantly butting up against these people need to do other work because we don't have in our organization a testing unit that does nothing but that. So if you had some automated, you know, fashion that you could run through the different steps that would cross platforms and manage that and run through it and go to a fail point and say that this didn't work out. And I know there's some products out there that we're starting to look at that and starting to embrace that as a quicker, better way to, you know, test these type of things.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the process of deciding which changes are going to get made. Will was talking about risk, which was very interesting to determine the level of risk involved with a requested change. And I was thinking that, you know, there's a lot of factors that go into this. I know we all talked about governance committees and all that kind of thing, but you're trying to put a lot of things into that decision. I use the term the intensity of the request. How intense is the request? How many, is it a volume of people? Is it the number of people that have requested it? Well, not all people, let's be honest, not all users are created equal. You could have a high-powered surgeon asking for something that's going to have a different level of weight behind it than low-level people in the organization. So I don't know if that informally gets factored in, those kind of things, or if they can be formally factored in, the number of people who's asking. And then, Art, you mentioned about the vendor feedback. And I don't know if you get to the point ever where the vendor says, we don't want you to do this, right? As opposed to we're going to do it at this point or we're not going to do it. And you say, well, we're going to do it. And they say, well, we don't want you to do it. Does that ever happen, Art, where you get pushback?
If I get the chief of anesthesia that wants something, he's going to push on the CEO, he's going to push on me, but I've always falled back on, okay, you actually ranked it with our questions and have embraced it because you were participating in deciding the questions and weighting and ranking. So we actually call them back on the table and say, look, you know, you ranked it this way. It's above all these other things. It's not, you know, they'll always, in healthcare, they'll always pull the patient safety card. Every single time, no matter what it is, it's patient safety, but we could be dispensing, you know, a peanut butter sandwich, for God's sake, out of dietary, and it's patient safety. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, the gravity is they will pull that card. And then we have to have these conversations, which is really good in IT, or particularly in our IT department. We have a physician's informatics, we have a nursing informatics, and we have a CMIO who is able to talk to their level. The IT geek like me can talk all day long to one of the surgeons or the anesthesia, but they have a different level of engagement when you start talking provider to provider, nurse to nurse, physician to physician, and it's a different conversation within IT and the end users when you start down that road. But to answer your question, there certainly is definitely a political hierarchy that happens with everything. I mean, we're not unique in healthcare, but it's there.
Josh, do you think that gets taken care of by the governance that you have in place, where you don't have to worry about that? That sort of all gets washed out by the time it comes to you. You're going to be executing. But I am curious about the risk level that may have to be communicated by someone like you back to the business or the operations people to say, yeah, you want this, but here's why we really might not want to do it.
I would love to say that's the case, right? That it doesn't come to me first, right? Or start in our area. We want to get there, right? That's absolutely our goal, right? Is we want to empower the business and clinical groups, and we do have governance established, right? And oversight committees that do sit on that side of the house. But generally it's still us taking requests, bringing those requests to them to then walk through that. So we have been establishing as part of our application review board is some of those things are brought in from us to that. So we start just like we have kind of a weighting system, right? Of how does it align to strategy? How does it align and impact clinical care? How many people does this touch in the organization, whether it's clinicians or patients, right? We do have a scoring system there, but part of our discovery process before we take it to the review committee is also doing an IT analysis. So this is security review, architecture review, system impacts, and those things are also brought to those review boards. So we are bringing these items to them, and then as part of that, we bring in the scoring, but then we also bring the INT impacts, right? And our organization has learned through a lot of pain points over the years that customizations have had to be unwinded, right, and brought back. So our leaders are starting to understand the impact, and when we say that if we do this customization, we now have a vendor Cerner that is saying, you can do that, but we're not going to support that. So if you have a production issue that falls into those lines, we can't support you unless that directly falls into something that our code is responsible for. So that does get weighted in there.
Very interesting. Will, I read a book recently called The Phoenix Project, which I imagine a lot of IT people know about. And one of the concepts in there was IT understanding how delicate a system may be or an application, and changes to that are not as easy as you might think because it's easily breakable. What are your thoughts about that, or anything else that our panelists have said?
Yeah, I think what, when we started this, the thing that clicked in my mind is that NASCAR expression: if you're not rubbing, you're not racing. And I think that innovation always has some level of risk to it. It's about pushing a little bit further than everybody else to be able to get into some type of market share. So when you're looking at the fragility of what you have kind of from an architectural perspective and a process perspective, really, you want to take all of that in mind, and you want to understand it, and you want to understand it globally, because if you go to somebody in an individual area like a claims department, they're going to say that they have the highest risk, that they're the most exposed. But you might also go over to somebody that's in the patient area, and they're going to say, no, it's us. And if you let everyone measure their risk, you're going to end up kind of with everything is impossible. But if you can get down to like a level where you really understand these core processes and what those outcomes are, you can really get to a spot where you understand, how we push innovation, and then what we're kind of exposing there, because, you have to think through it. I think that's why I also said earlier that testing begins at the requirement. Like, you've got to think longer. You don't want to think short term, because then you create technical debt. But you want to be able to push those envelopes of what the business is seeing and what the business wants to drive. So you need to be ready to be able to address it through some channel.
All right, very good. Let's go to our next question. We're going to start with Josh. If newly updated or customized software doesn't work as planned, what's your process for getting the errors diagnosed and fixed?
So I touched on it lightly before. So we, as part of our implementation steps, and the more complex it is, the more rigorous those implementation steps are. We have established command center for triaging issues coming in, so that's everything from first level to third level support, which could include the vendor as well, engaged during that cutover of that code itself. As part of that, we also have backup plans, right? So that's always one of the first steps you look at is, right, as soon as there's an issue, mostly it's an impactful issue, right? Can we back that out? Can we revert to the previous stage? A lot of times you can't, right? Or that is so involved, right? You don't want to pull that right away. So what we usually try to do is step very quickly into understanding the process, and then we try to recreate, right? So we step back into the earlier environments, right? That 10% build, that 100% environments, we try to recreate there very, very quickly based off of the workflows that have been described to us. Hopefully there we can identify that process. We usually have the vendor engaged at that point, and they're engaged as well in troubleshooting and investigating. In some cases, we're in production, turning on logs, doing other items like that to really get to that root cause. At this point, then, once we identify that issue, then we run it through that same chain. It's the same process. It's expedited, of course, right? But we still go through, one or two domains. We do another round of testing, validation. We're not breaking something else with that change or fix that we're just about to implement, right? And then we go through the communication process, and then we execute that change.
How often do you want to make a change that the vendor says, we're not going to have any part of that, so you're on your own with that one? And then that's more risk, right? Because then you mentioned talking to the vendor for some help. They're not there to help if you've gone ahead when they advised you not to.
We're a lot less likely to do that these days. We are very much so aligned with Cerner's roadmap. Cerner has their model healthcare system, right, that we're aligning to. And so in some cases, we're reverting those configurations, those customizations that we've done 5, 10 years in the past, right, to align to that model system. So we can get that right level of support, and then standardized workflows with Cerner, but also with our national standards as well.
Art?
Unlike Josh, we tend to push a little bit harder on Epic and what we want to change and how we want to change it. We were one of the first when they didn't support running it on Linux, and we sat it on Linux and said, we're going to do it this way in 2003. And they said, we don't support it. We only do HP and this. And we said, well, okay, we're doing it this way. Lo and behold, that's their preferred platform at this point in time. So we tend to push a little bit more than in Josh's area, but we do actively consider their roadmap. I mean, just like Cerner, they're just cranking through, best practices. And I mean, sometimes it's hard to keep up with us. And that takes me back to the original comment about doing some software customizations. I think at times the functionality might actually already be there, and it's just such a behemoth. We're going, we want to do this, and Epic will go, or one of the, tech services groups will go, it's already here. Here's the note on it. Here's the programming note on it. Just put it in. So we tend to, as an organization, or I think other organizations tend to get a little bit behind in their development and understanding what their development is. We're taking updates every quarter. So every 3 months, we're on a cycle. And the amount of change that comes through that is hard to quantify and understand. So you need to value the vendor's input and say, well, we're going to have it next quarter. Okay, well, we'll wait for that. Or it's already there because we didn't know it, because there's just so much functionality in there and development that we can't possibly at times keep up with all the notes and the releases, the release notes. We're not using that part of it, but all of a sudden, hey, yeah, you can just do it. Here it is. So that's a challenge, I think, for us as well. And like you said, when we do the testing and everything, and to Josh's point, change control requires a backup plan, or it requires you to actually say, if you can't back this out, this is the ramifications, and we have to keep moving forward, and now we need to fix it. So before it gets approved by the board to move forward and go live, that's what happens. You got to have your plan set to say, and you got to have your plan so solid here at Cambridge that if it's Art's plan and Art gets run over by a bus, then Josh can go back this out by following the instructions that are in that plan. He can go do that without me and understands it. So there's always that give and take. Is it perfect? Probably not all the time, but that's our mode.
Will, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you have any advice on dealing with one's software vendor when changes are not totally lining up? Meaning, it's not as simple as, oh, we've got that, or that's no problem. When it's a different kind of feedback from the vendor, and it's more involved, it may not be absolutely not, or we'll have no part of it, but it's something more nuanced. What's your advice on dealing with that situation?
Yeah, I think that when you look here, the frequency of change that we're subject to kind of in the digital era is one that it doesn't even become about a vendor. It becomes about what you do for yourself. There's the concept of shift left, which we talked about. If we can get testing all the way up there at the requirement and do the right things at the requirement, we know that we'll suffer less defects because we're putting more forethought up into what we're bringing into the system. But there's also a concept of shift right. And what that needs to be is we've got to get automation and testing assets closer to production that run at a high frequency. Because where we are as an industry is, one, we have, or just in kind of the whole digital market, where we have, Windows now releasing changes on a quarterly basis. We have Chrome releasing them on a weekly basis. And we're subject to so much higher degree of change that we need to be accounting for that, because some of these things aren't taking place simply in releases. They're taking place in business as usual. So we've got to have a focus there. And then also what you're trying to do is like what Art said, you're always trying to have your next realm of solutions ready to go, or you need to have some type of speed to be able to get those into production to mitigate those issues, or you need to have some type of exit strategy. So you've always got to have plan A, B, and C as far as what you're doing for when something is introduced. And finally, my final thought is, when we talk about an application, it becomes kind of fairly straightforward. I made this change to this application and I deployed it, and now I have this problem. And so I know what I need to do. But a lot of times the way we're operating is on a project basis. And it's like, I have this business vision that I want to implement, and it's going to touch 6 or 7 different parts of our company. And we need to move those into production. And it becomes much more ambiguous in terms of like where that change was. So you have got to have this high degree again of just being able to validate that all assumptions are met. As well as I think now with like the whole DevOps movement, you're seeing people break things down into more application based as opposed to kind of more project based to avoid that project blindness.
All right, next question. Many say software customization is necessary, but excessive customization can negate the benefits of having an enterprise and interoperable software platform. We've seen this in very large health systems that span multiple states and have, very large health systems where you have regions, and the customization that's done to an enterprise piece of software leaves them almost on different systems, and they have interoperability challenges. And Josh, you were talking about customization versus configuration, and how it sounded like you were saying configuration, which you would think you'd be safe doing. It sounds like you're working within the space you're allowed to play, can leave you almost in the same position as if you'd customized. Is that right? Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've definitely ran into those scenarios of the year. So Cerner, you get back 15, 20 years ago, that was something Cerner prided themselves in, was their flexibility in their systems. And their flexibility was a combination of configurations you can do, and you could do extreme configuration flexes in different directions, along with developmental tools that you could program directly into Cerner as well to enhance things. The problem was as Cerner grew and their clientele expanded, they had to manage literally hundreds, if not thousands of different code levels and code bases, right? Because their clients were on all different code sets. And when you were configuring to those edge cases, right, that they weren't necessarily completely accounting for, as you started to upgrade, those edge cases would start burning you in your customizations or your custom configurations. To the point where Cerner has, brought their clients in now over the years to get to within a couple code releases, much more standardization. As part of that, we've brought back a lot of those extreme configurations that really didn't align to Cerner's roadmaps, right, of what they do. When it comes to customizations now, so the configurations have been reined in a bit. There's still a lot of flexibility there, but we try not to stray too far into those edge cases. From a customization perspective, right, we're now doing more development. So we're doing mobile development, we're doing smart on fire development. So when Cerner doesn't meet something that we need from a workflow or process perspective, we actually looked at, can we develop a very, very pointed process or solution that can embed within Cerner or can integrate, as opposed to modifying this behemoth, right? So we've had some good luck there. Cerner's doing it, Epic's allowing, smart on fire. So you're allowed to do these very purpose-built workflows, right, with these development tools without modifying the EHRs themselves.
All right, just tell me a little bit more about this process. Josh used the word embed and integrate. You used the word back in. So this is what we're talking about, is when you make customizations to a vendor product, somehow they reabsorb what the changes you made. Is that only if they like it and think they're worthwhile and want to make it part of what they offer? How does that work?
So if we make the customization similar to Josh, and we work along with the vendor and we code it, there's what we kind of term a community library. So in other words, the library, it publishes it and people can take advantage of that. In other institutions, if Epic allows you to publish it to the community library, you can use the content if we so desire. And oftentimes what they'll end up doing is they'll look at that and go, we've actually heard from our development teams and our tech services, this request 300 times across 300 different clients, right? Cambridge has coded it, so we're actually coding for them. They massage it, put it in there to make sure it becomes part of their rev. In the next release, we've actually coded it for them. So they're actually using their customers to do some development for them across the board. You don't end up getting price breaks, but the fact of the matter is that, that integration and that back and forth sometimes goes both ways. We are supporting them and they're supporting us. And then it gets baked into their product at that point forward.
Will, your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the way that you partner with a vendor and you start to co-develop. And as I mentioned earlier, you have to, the innovation is what's really driving some of this change. And since you're the first to innovate, sometimes you're the leader in that space and you have to, assess the risk and go out there and make that change. And then what you see is the competition starts to follow, and then vendors say, ooh, well, this was a good change and we should totally take this on. I think this also goes into, the cycles that applications go through. I mean, we're talking, Josh was saying Cerner, 15 years of Cerner. And if you're not constantly like working in this way of like kind of cleansing, you're creating this technical debt. And like what you could end up with is a configuration where maybe there's 100 or 200 fields now on a page, and that load time starts to suffer. And I think that this is from a software platform and an end user standpoint where you start to see people circumvent the system. Now it's easier for me to put something on a sticky note than it is to enter it into this. And I think this is really where analytics kind of help and time projections of analytics. As far as if you look at, execution of a test case, and if it's automated, you can look at it and you can say, it takes 2 minutes to run this test case at, greenfield launch of this application. And then over time, as you're making these configurations and customizations, you're seeing this process extend, to 4 minutes or to 5 minutes. And if you basically put 10x on that, you understand now what the manual user is going through, the end user is going through. And you can actually start to kind of assess this and project this technical debt that you're creating by adding these customizations or configuration changes in large quantities.
All right, we're going to go to my favorite part, our Ask a Co-Panelist feature. Will, why don't you go first? Do you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my question would be, when you look at what you're doing from a technology standpoint and from like a speed to market, how big of a role do you put quality in that seat as far as like one of the driving changes for being able to get that innovation faster?
Art, why don't you go first?
So we rely heavily on the coding quality of the product that we're going to turn out. In other words, we don't force it down. Some of these things are relatively complicated coding to get done and testing to it. So we try not to sacrifice the quality. Where we run up against issues at times with this is when there's a severe patient experience of care, which is part of quality, and or a patient safety issue. Typically, and I'm fairly sure Josh's vendors do this as well, if you end up with a patient safety issue, they're going to jump on it with you at the same time for all of their accounts. For a quality issue on the coding, we look back towards, that's one of the ranking things is, patient experience of care and quality. What is the impact that this will do for that category on your rank of coding? So in other words, is it going to make patient experience of care and quality better if we code this outside of cycle and do that? That's one of the ranks that are in that ranking that I was talking about when we decide to do something. And then that drives us, we have to pay attention to the quality of coding. And then what we're always continually following up on in that case is, we're now going to take the next revision in 3 months. Are we going to break that? What we just did, is Epic going to change something in their coding, in their base code, that we now need to test that and then recode that? So to Josh's point and Will's earlier, we've got all of this going on at the same time, and we end up with constant juggling to make sure that we don't break anything over time and watch the code that we do.
Josh?
Yeah, I think Art hit it pretty well. I mean, quality is part of every aspect of that request coming in through the execution, right? So it's quality in coding, it's quality in execution, it's quality in testing. It's highly important, right? It suffers when it's urgent, right? Your quality can suffer, and that's something you have to be careful about. And right, that's why you have good processes in place to hopefully catch potential areas where you have quality issues. So that's why you have robust testing plans, you have robust change control processes, why you do code reviews. But it's one of the most important things to think about through the different stages of the process.
Art, do you have a question for your co-panelists?
I would be interested to understand if they've used any automated testing tools and any experience about that, or given it thought in their organizations either way.
Josh?
We really don't today. It's important. We've had lots of discussions over the years around automated testing processes and tools, right? I think very similar to what you had said, right? We're hands at the keyboard, we're many resources, writing test plans, we're executing test plans, re-executing test plans. We'd love to get past that. We'd love to speed that up. We'd like to use our resources to do the smart, good work, right? And things like testing that could be automated, right? We want to take those responsibilities off of them. This actually would lead into a question I have for Will, which is around that he spends so much time and resources, right, running test plans and implementing. We've had a hard time redirecting those resources to put effort into automation and going towards automated solutions. And I'm curious how you see people tackle that.
Yeah, so we definitely see people tackle this through our software, through our automation software, because what it's doing is, I think when you look at automation, there's build your own, where you create your own framework, or there's going through like a vendor like Tricentis, where it is what we've done. We've created this framework that we provide this user interface for people to be able to very easily go in and learn to automate, and they experience something that's much more like application driven, something that they're much more familiar with. And the power of that is then allowing those SMEs to be able to empower themselves to do something like create automation and be able to then leverage that time that they wouldn't normally have because of manual testing to help drive other business initiatives. So by being able to give them a tool to be able to learn a skill like automation that they hadn't previously been able to do, you empower your people, and then you have huge gains from an organization standpoint, because each time you run that automated asset, you're saving money and you're getting value. So that's kind of how we approached it, is making sure that we're developing a solution that works for the user to be able to learn and empower themselves. And that's where we've had huge success, is being able to go in, recognize all this value that you have from a person perspective, and then giving them something that allows them to drive themselves forward. And then it also helps the company, because then it allows them to use developers and engineers more driven towards innovation and good code for customizations, as opposed to working on test frameworks.
All right, let's go with some final thoughts here. Final piece of advice based on your experience, something you've found has worked well, or you've learned over time that this is a best practice that you've identified. A little parting word of advice for our audience. Art, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so overall, actually, the only parting advice I have is patience. I know everybody is going to drive at you from either direction, but if you don't temper that and have patience inside of IT, we tend to rush things to completion at times. And having that patience and trying to impress upon them you're doing, and set the expectations up. I see managers at times in the different areas in IT get really impatient with their analysts and their coders, and they're pushing it through because they're getting pressured. It's important that your senior leadership gets in front of you and says, look, you can pressure us, but the fact of the matter is that if we do this wrong, you're going to be in a worse space than you were to begin with. So let us go through our iteration. Let us go through our processes. Let us go through our testing. We think it's a valid request, but let us do it the correct way. And often it's just like they're seeing one side of the equation, the patient side of it, and what they need in the EHR or the product. And they need it now to do their job. We understand that, and articulating, we understand you and hear you, but let us get through the process, because it's going to turn out bad on the end run. I mean, and that's my parting advice, I guess I should say.
Very good, Art. Josh?
When customizing or modifying a solution, I think we've talked about this. It's important to have vendor and or development alignment as part of that, not only with the current state, but also your roadmap and their roadmap of where you're going. Secondarily, it's important to understand how far into that edge case you're getting, right? How far is that customization straying within the system, the tool, the platform, the workflow, and the potential impacts of that, of that pushing to those edge cases. The cost of customization ultimately could be extremely significant in the long run if you're not taking into account your roadmap, better roadmap planning, the amount of reach into those edge cases. So it's important, because the overhead on quality control, testing, and support, right, can be significant over time.
Will, your final thought?
Yeah, it's changed the measure. So we look at testing as something that it's like, oh, well, we ran 10,000 test cases, so we must be ready, or that we have this volume of test cases, and so we have good coverage. It's look at the risk coverage, get down to risk, and then understand how those test cases align to covering that risk, and then start to focus on measuring what you've done from an execution standpoint against that risk. So that will help you greatly reduce the redundancy that you have in your test suites, and then being able to execute faster.
Well, that was great. I learned a lot. Regarding continuing education, you can use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when this on-demand recording is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to register for our upcoming events. With that, I want to thank our excellent panel for a lively and very interesting conversation. Art Ream, Josh Wherry, and Will Berry, and I want to thank Tricentis for making this event possible, and I want to thank our attendees for coming. With that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.